Before we get started, though, just a couple of points. Um, there's a kind of a big event in the life of churches, in the life of our faith coming up at the end of the month. That's Easter. I know that Heather spoke about it just briefly. But as your pastor, let me maybe just pass along a bit of conviction and encouragement for you. A couple of things. One, we have these invites. We'd love for you. We created these. We printed them so you could take them and invite your friends and family to join you at service. And in fact, that's how I would tell you to invite somebody. Is go, hey, I'd love for you to join me for Easter service, or Good Friday, or our Passover feast. And then I also want to encourage you, just really quickly, we're having two services, 8:30 and 10 o'clock. I want to encourage you to go to the 8:30 service. I know it's really early. Just pretend it's a sunrise service and you'll feel good about yourself. Because the reason is we're going to need every available seat for the 10 o'clock service. This place is going to be packed. We're going to be overflow. We're going to be pulling, I promise, little plastic chairs out of the kindergarten classrooms. And if you show up at 10 o'clock, you might be sitting in a kindergarten chair, and it's uncomfortable. Believe me, I've done it. So I want to encourage you to show up to the 8:30 service, but not just that, show up to the 8:30 service and then sign up to serve for the 10 o'clock service. Find somewhere that you can maybe engage in service. We ask you to serve not because we want something from you, but because we have something for you. We feel like in serve groups, community is created as you begin to talk with the people that you're serving along, and you have an opportunity to engage with them, maybe on a level that you normally wouldn't engage with somebody on, because maybe they just sit in a different part of the auditorium, and you just don't ever get to say hi to them. But when you serve together, you engage, you hear their story, you learn their names, and it's an opportunity to create a history and something together. So I just want to encourage you in that. You'll have an opportunity to sign up at the Connect wall today. And then one last thing before we get into the message. I'm so geeked up right now. This feels like it's a year in the making. We're starting this series, the Freedom the Moses series today. And to celebrate that, I have a gift for everybody today after service. Last year, you may remember we did this. We do series stickers that you can put on your window or your water bottle or something like that. We have one of these for everybody if you want one. And then moms, we doubled down on you and we got you something extra special. We have the magnet version of this that you can put on your fridge and take one more piece of paper and stick it up on the fridge. But I promise this magnet's not going to fall off and you're not going to get frustrated at it. It's going to stick up there. As we get ready to get started in the series, as we're going to look at today, I have a question for you, and not a rhetorical question. I would invite you, with a little bit of censorship in your answers, what is America going to be remembered for 3,000 years from now? When historians are looking back on the journey of America, what do you think that we're going to be remembered for? Maybe good, bad? What do you think it is? Somebody holler something out. Battle to keep our freedom. Okay, so I have the Declaration of Independence on my list. I'm a history major. I've got a pretty good list. I'm quietly judging you by your answers now. What else? What else are we going to remember for? What are some like the greatest hits of America? What? Abolition of slavery. What else? What? Okay, our stance on abortion. What else? Freedom. I didn't hear what he said. Back-to-back world champions. Okay. How about this? Man, y'all's list. Boston Tea Party. The willingness to say we're not going to put up with something that's not right or fair. The acknowledgement of the stain of slavery on our nation and the acknowledgement to say we're going to change it. How about the man on the moon? Remember that one? What else is on my list? The discovery of electricity. You're welcome, world. America wins 1-0. What else is on my list? Advances in medicine and healthcare. Anybody praise the Lord for local anesthesia when you have to go to the dentist? That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? The internet. Good, bad, or indifferent. I remember I said good or bad. We have a lot in just the short 248-year history of America that we can point to and go, look at the things that we have done, the differences that we've made in the world, the way that we've moved, the way that we've changed. 248 years of history that we're working off of when we think about this list for America, and when we think about the history of the Jewish people and the history of our faith outside of the story of Christ, I would argue that the most impactful and important story that you can read in all of Scripture is the one that we're going to start studying today, and that's the story of Moses and the exodus of the people of Israel from slavery under the Egyptians. It's the most important story outside of Christ. When we close the story of Genesis, we have about 70 people going into Egypt to live there. Joseph, if you'll remember, is placed second in charge over everything. His brothers and father and their family move in, and they begin to enjoy a place of power and importance in the nation of Egypt. They begin to lead and they begin to multiply. And over the next 430 years, we go from the 70 initial people to nearly 2 million people at where we pick up the story today. It's the story that we learn as kids back in whatever your Sunday school was called when you were growing up. If I was going to walk around the room individually and said, hey, give me your top 10 Bible stories, I guarantee you at least 3 of your top 10 would be from this story. Don't believe me? Everybody's church. I can see it in your eyes and the look on your face. You're like, okay, what happened in the Exodus story? Let me. I've got a list. I mean, you could barely even go to church and you've heard about this story. Hollywood did one of the best grossing films of all time with Charlton Heston, depicting this story. That's how iconic it is. Here's just a list of things. You guys remember Moses in the reed basket, little baby Moses in the basket, getting set off in the Nile? And I just imagine like piranhas jumping and crocodiles snapping and hippopotamuses trying to take him out, right? That's at least what I thought of. The burning bush, anybody remember that? Does that make your top 10 events in the Bible? That would make my top 10 in the Bible. What's next? How about the plagues? Anybody remember the plagues? Would that make your top 10? Would it? It would make my top 10. How about the Red Sea? Remember the Red Sea? Yeah, that would make my top 10. The pillar of fire and smoke, the quail and the manna, Moses on the mountain with the 10 commandments and then coming down and his face glowing so brightly because of the presence of God that the people of Israel were scared of him. And for the next 30 or so years, he had to wear a veil over his face because they were frightened because his face shone with the power and the glory of God. And lest we just all think about the good things, how about the golden calf at the bottom of Mount Sinai, the mountain of God? Do you remember that one? The people turning over all of their gold and jewelry is because Moses has been on the mountain so long, and they start to get scared, and they say to Aaron, the first high priest, they say, hey, make a god for us to worship like we had back in Egypt, and they make the golden calf, and they fall down to worship, and then right as they begin to worship, what happens? You remember? Moses comes down the mountain, and he gets what? He gets really mad, doesn't he? It's like mom and dad when you don't clean your room like you're supposed to. Lincoln's like, oh man, they're in trouble. So think about the list that we just did. 2 lists this morning. We did America, 248 years, and then I just briefly did a list of the story of Exodus. You want to know how long? All that list that I just gave you, 18 months. It all happened in 18 months. From the moment the burning bush happened and God calls Moses to Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments is only 18 months. 18 months and all that happened. 430 years of God seemingly doing nothing after Joseph and his family enters into Egypt. 430 years of silence, of nothing, of going, what's happening? And then suddenly in 18 months, God does all that he does. And sometimes we like to focus on the end of the story. We like to look at the promised land and the people of Israel marching around Jericho, blasting the trumpets, don't we? That's the fun part of the story. We all like to jump to Joshua and read Joshua. We like to read the beginning in Exodus, and we like to read the end of the story in Joshua, but none of us here, and be honest, because if you say otherwise, I know you're lying, nobody likes to read Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the only reason you do read it is because it's in your year through the Bible plan, and you're like, oh my goodness, I got to read through Leviticus. How long is this going to take me? The problem in doing that is the beginning and the end are just a very minuscule part of the story. We learn in the in-between. We grow in the in-between. We need the whole story. The whole story is important. We learn through it. And so that's what we're going to do this year. We're going to look at the whole story and see what God has for us. And so let's start our journey at the beginning, and let's take an exodus out of our comfortability. The hearing aids are getting in the way. Let's take an exodus out of the status quo. Let's take a personal exodus out of the ho-hum of life. Let's begin our reading and look on in awe at what the God of the universe did to the people of Israel. Now there arose a new king over Egypt. We're going to skip the first 7 verses of chapter 1. That's okay, you can go back and read them. Who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Let us come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Now, before we move on, let's just clear up some things. Does anybody read this and say to yourself, how do we go from a Pharaoh that knows Joseph and everything that he did to a guy who doesn't know anything that Joseph did? Does anybody read that and just go, that doesn't make any sense to me? I'm the only one. There's a few of us honest out there. I read that and it makes no sense to me. I go, okay, I don't understand how we go from verse 7, which we didn't read, where it's listing out all of the people that were there, to verse 8, where there's a Pharaoh who arose who didn't know Joseph. What you have to understand is from the end of Genesis, in the first verse of Exodus chapter 1 to verse 8 of Exodus chapter 1 is 300 years have taken place. They're in Egypt for a total of about 430 years. 300 of those years take place between verse 1 of chapter 1 of Exodus and verse 8 of chapter 1 of Exodus. And what you also have to understand is that when Joseph came into Egypt and he's in the house, and then the wife tries to convince him to do something that he shouldn't do, and he flees and he goes to prison and he interprets the dream, and then Pharaoh elevates him to the second position, the second in hierarchy of all of the people of Israel. The Pharaoh that does that is not a native Egyptian. He's not Egyptian by birth. He's actually Semitic by birth. He's from the same area as Joseph. He's like a foreign occupier. These people have come into Egypt and they've taken over and they're ruling Egypt. He recognizes Joseph as some kind of kindred, at least they're from the same place, likely spoke the same language. God intervenes. Joseph miraculously interprets the dream. He's elevated to a position of authority, and under this position of authority, God begins to bless the people of Israel, and they begin to multiply over and over and over again. So for 300 years, that's happening. They're leading. They're foreign occupiers. And then what happens in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. What you have to understand is what that word arose mean. Now, when we think of kings and pharaohs taking over, right, I just think about like in England, if King Charles is sick, he's got cancer. If he abdicates or steps down, what happens? His son takes over, right? That's how we do it. Well, this word arose here, literally what that means is they took over by violence. And so what's actually happening is native Egyptians who have been under foreign rule for 300 years are finally fed up. They rise up against these foreign occupiers, and there's a battle, and they take the country back over. They fight, they dispose this foreign king. A new Pharaoh arises over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. People of Israel have been part of ruling native Egyptians this whole time. So when this new guy takes over, he looks at the people of Israel and says, uh-oh, look how many of them there are. They're well fed. They've been in a position of power. We've got to turn the tables on them. And overnight, they become public enemy number one. They become a national security threat. So this new Pharaoh institutes a series of things that puts them into slavery and then begins to oppress them mightily. Does that make sense? We're all at the same level. Perfect. Overnight, they become a national security threat. The Egyptians didn't want them walking around free because they were fearful of what might happen. What if another group of people come in and they take over, and so they're enslaved? And we continue our reading in verse 12 of chapter 1. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field and all their work. They ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So they've gone from ruling to now ruthlessly working as slaves. They got kind of the short end of the stick, yeah? It would be like I don't even know I couldn't even compare it to something like that you might go through today. To go from a position of authority and wealth and incredible influence to now having nothing and having to work as a slave. But here's what I know. Here's what I know, and this is in your sermon guide, and you can look at this. And the first thing is this: is that bad circumstances don't represent God's displeasure. There's two things up there that I changed, so ignore those. Bad circumstances don't represent God's displeasure. And the inverse is true. Good circumstances don't necessarily represent God's favor. Just because life isn't going great for you doesn't mean that God's displeased with you. And just because you have everything that you could ever possibly want doesn't mean that God's totally blessing you in everything that you do. Now, before anybody takes this one step too far, let me say this, that if you're living a life of sin, you're willfully choosing to do things that you know that you shouldn't do, you can be sure that God's displeasure is going to be shown in your life. You will suffer the consequences of your choices. Your sins are forgiven, but that doesn't mean that you won't suffer the consequences of your choice. You choose to go out tonight and sin and get drunk and drive, and you get into a car accident and you kill somebody. You can be in a relationship with Jesus and that sin can be forgiven for you, but you're still going to suffer the consequences of your choice. Bad circumstances don't represent God's displeasure. The same is true. Good circumstances don't always represent God's favor. But here's the thing, is it actually gets worse. The story gets worse for the people of Israel. You think, how can it get worse? They're being made to work ruthlessly as slaves. How can it get worse? How can it get any worse than just being a slave? Let's read verse 15 and see how it gets worse. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of who was named Sephora and the other Puah. That's how I'm going to say that name. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's how I'm going to say it. When you serve as a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now, just leave the verse up there. We're going to pause for just a second. They don't have ultrasound. They can't tell if it's a boy or girl in the womb. So what the Pharaoh is telling them to do is that at the moment of birth, when you can tell if it's a boy or a girl, if it's a boy, you kill that newborn baby. If it's a girl, let her live. Verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. Verse 18. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. Can you just imagine, like, these two women that are in charge of all the midwives? Pharaoh gives them this rule. They disobey this command that he says, and then he calls them in. This is a guy that's saying, kill all the newborn males of the Jews. Can you imagine getting that phone call or that? It's not a text message. What it would be, like a papyrus read with some hieroglyphs on it, like, hey, you got to come see Pharaoh. Man, can you imagine the nerves walking into that room? What is this guy going to do if he's willing to kill a newborn? What's he going to do? What's he going to do to us? So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Okay. Just they give birth really fast. That's what that means. Just being honest, I think. Verse 20, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and they grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Man alive. This dude was just wicked. He tries to get the midwives at the moment of birth, and then when they don't obey, he then just he releases the people he releases the Egyptians onto the Jewish people and said, hey, if you see a little boy, throw him in the Nile, let him drown. Does the story sound a little familiar? If it doesn't, I would encourage you to go read about the birth of Christ in the New Testament. Another ruthless king who was scared ordered the newborn boys to be murdered and killed in an effort to stop something that God was doing. There's a reason in the New Testament that this is called the first Exodus, what we're going to study this year. And then what Jesus does is called the second Exodus, because Jesus leads us out of captivity and sin here into the ultimate promised land, which is heaven. The story sounds familiar because God is at work. The story makes sense to us when it shouldn't make sense, is because God is at work. I'm noticing that the sermon guides are off today. I apologize. That should be a point. That should be on the. Is that on the screen? Do we have that one? God is at work. Yeah, it'll work. God is at work. Making sure I was preaching the right message. I am. It's okay. Even in this, God's at work. He's at work in the good. He's at work in the bad. He's at work in the ugly and the beautiful, the chaos and the peace, and the hope and the sorrow. God is at work. Here's my question. Do you believe that in your life today, that God is at work? 430 years of silence from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. God was at work. Even though we don't know what he was doing, even though we can't look back to it, we know that he was at work. 430 years of silence for the Jewish people. I wonder for some of us sitting in the audience today, how long does it feel like God's been silent in your life? Has it been a week? Maybe it's been a month. Maybe it's been 6 months. Maybe it's been a year or 2 years or 5 years since you felt like God has moved in your life. You're not sure and you don't understand what he could possibly be doing in this moment. It's confusing for you. It doesn't make sense. That's okay, because God is at work. The worship team is going to come up. They're going to lead us in a new song, in a song, and as they come up, I want to remind you what Romans 8 says. Romans 8, verse 26 says this: "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." Verse 27, "And he who searches the hearts knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things, the beauty, the ugly, the chaos, the peace, the misunderstanding, the I don't know what God's doing, the pain and the suffering, all things work together for the good of those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose." Church, I don't know where you're at. I know that none of you were where the Israelite people were, the Jewish people were. None of you are being forced to work as slaves right now. And if you are, you should need to come talk to me after church. We need to do something about that. But God was at work in their lives just as the same way that he's at work in your life. He's the same God then as he is now. He has a plan and a purpose for you. And he's a God that never fails. Would you stand and sing with us?